The medieval period, or the Middle Ages as terms, will be used interchangeably. This historical stretch is the period between the fall of the Roman Empire in 410 AD and the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453. It is important to recognize that the Middle Ages, or medieval period, are not just temporal categories, but geographically and culturally specific. So, defining this period is different from simply saying the 10th century AD, which provides a global chronology. The Middle Ages is a term just as culturally specific to the Western world as the Meiji period in Japan or the Vedic period in India. Through the following 3 case studies, we will explore the fascinating world of disability in the medieval period. From birth to death, whether a peasant or a king, life was dominated by the religion you were born into. Christianity, the dominant religion in Western Europe, held mixed views on disability. Within the Bible, especially the Old Testament, disability was aligned with sin and punishment, but in the New Testament disability was aligned with healing and martyrdom. Some medieval priests and scholars believed that a body would be corrupted by sin and therefore divine punishment took the form of physical illnesses. However, opposing schools of thought revolved around the concept that those with disabilities showed a higher form of piety than those who weren't disabled. Despite the misunderstood causes of disability, Christians subscribed to, their charitable endeavors spurred on by their scriptures, led to them playing a pivotal role in the lives of the disabled. The scale of support that Christianity provided to the disabled was something previously unseen throughout history. It was during the medieval period that specialist institutions for caring for disabled people first appeared. These were often part of religious institutions and would care for people with leprosy, blindness, or physical disabilities. Monasteries or abbeys first began accepting passing strangers who were ill and letting them stay until they recovered. Soon afterwards, the first hospitals began appearing which provided more long-term care for sick people. Britain's first hospital for mental illness opened in the medieval period. It was originally known as Bethlehem Hospital in London, but this was later shortened to Bedlam. The quality of care in these institutions was highly questionable and the patients were often abused. By the late Middle Ages, London had about 35 hospitals ranging in size from large ones to some no bigger than a cottage. Alternatively, almshouses provided long-term shelter for disabled or elderly people. Places in almshouses were often sought after because they provided sanctuary and security, which was considerably better than living on the streets and begging. Day-to-day life in the almshouses usually consisted of praying and devotion to religion. The legacy of these endeavors were that they began the progression of the concept that support for the disabled should be considered in part a responsibility of the broader society instead of solely the responsibility of localized community efforts. The people, religious institutions, and towns and cities of the medieval period were pioneers in terms of providing a specialized response to disability. Only a small number of their buildings remain, but over the next 500 years their early professional approach would eventually develop into our modern system of public services. In the ancient world, the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians progressed medical practices greatly. Once these civilizations collapsed, the accumulated knowledge of these societies wasn't entirely lost, but the speed and coverage that this knowledge spread was diminished. Through the Arabic scholars that translated this medical knowledge then, through the Byzantium institutions in Constantinople, this translated work was slowly disseminated into Europe throughout the centuries of the Middle Ages. This meant there was a stark difference between the knowledge base of European doctors from the early to the late Middle Ages. The very first medical universities were established in the late Middle Ages, which also played an important role in the expansion of medical science. Medieval medical practices were an interesting intersection of the ancient works already mentioned, traditional pagan practices, astrology, Christian beliefs and old wives' tales, which led to very varied results for the patients receiving these treatments. Meaning a simple virus, infection or injury, through misdiagnosis and mistreatment had a high chance of resulting in permanent disability or death. Some of these unique and some downright terrifying treatment methods include bloodletting. If you visited a doctor during the Middle Ages, regardless of your illness, he would have probably prescribed you with the classic bloodletting treatment. Bloodletting was as common back then as cold medicine is today. If a patient went in with a mild headache and a sore throat, it was common practice for a physician to open a vein with a lancet, and then let the blood flow freely into a container. Bloodletting was so common that even barbers of the era began to offer the service, along with stylish trims and shaves. Some people would have the treatment several times a year as a way of staying healthy. Trepanning. Trepanning is a surgical procedure that involves the drilling or boring of a hole into the human skull. This painful hole exposes the dura mater, an outer membrane of the brain, which physicians use to treat an array of different health problems. Doctors used this practice in the Middle Ages to treat illnesses like epilepsy, migraines, and a variety of mental disorders. If you were suffering from depression, a little hole to the head was in order. Unfortunately, the hole to the head commonly exposed the brain to airborne germs, and it often proved fatal for patients. Charms. These magical remedies were not without benefit, since they sometimes incorporated medicinal plants and other therapeutic substances. Nonetheless, the treatments usually contained fewer beneficial components than comparable non-magical recipes. Cataract surgery. During the early days of the Middle Ages, surgeons used a painful process called needling to perform cataract surgery. It involved a thick flat needle which a doctor would push directly into the edge of a person's cornea, with no anesthetics, except for maybe a cup of bitter red wine. The idea behind this technique was to push the opaque lens back into the lowest part of the eye, which would result in a clear pupil. However, the ailing patient was typically left with an unfocused eye, sort of like a camera with no lens. The amount of vision would only allow a person to read the huge letters found in modern eye tests. Many scholars, such as Ulrich Steicher, author of A History of Disability, would argue that people living with disabilities were no less undistinguished at the dawn of the Middle Ages from the economically weak, due to the intensive labor that constituted agriculture during this time period. Many peasants and serfs have been found with extensive spinal and limb injuries, as well as stunted growth, malnutrition, and general deformities. Despite the lower classes experiencing higher rates of disability, disability did occur throughout all of the classes. However, the treatment of the disabled did differ vastly, depending on their place. If you were disabled, of the lower class, and didn't have a strong support system of family or community, you were among the most vulnerable populations of Europe, open to harassment and abuse. The following examples highlight that mistreatment. Idiot cage. Idiot cages were a common sight across Europe. They were cages placed in town squares, where people with varying disabilities were locked in. One source states that this was a method to keep homeless disabled people safe at night. However, every other source found states that this was more so a cruel form of entertainment for the able-bodied people of these towns. Betting on the blind. This was a common source of entertainment across Europe, where a handful of blind individuals would be placed in an enclosed area, and each given a stick. People would then bet on who would be the last standing, as they swung their sticks wildly at each other. Variations of this spectacle existed where a large animal would also be placed in there with them, such as a wild boar or aggressive bull. Ship of fools. Some persons with disabilities, particularly those considered unproductive dependents, were shipped off to other lands. Some communities paid sailors to take such individuals away so they would no longer pose a burden. This practice led to the ships of fools, the boats that would sail from port to port, charging admission to view their supposed strange human cargo. Eventually, the ships would abandon their passengers at another port, forcing them to fend for themselves. The legend of the ships of fools is well documented in literature as a symbol of perceptions of madness. While the actual practice of shipping off people with disabilities may have been rare, the popularity of the legend suggests that society wanted to separate itself from deviant populations. At the other end of the social class hierarchy, life with a disability was still difficult, but they had much less to overcome with the benefit of wealth and the opportunities that came with life in the upper classes. Charles VI, nicknamed the Beloved and later the Mad, was King of France from 1380 until his death in 1422. He is known for his mental illness and psychotic episodes which plagued him throughout his life. Natural fools. This term was given to those with learning disabilities, who could be brought into royal courts as either jesters or, surprisingly, as counsels for the king or queen. Their directness and their humor were valued as assets and woven into the fabric of court life. Believed to be closer to God and closer to the truth than other people, but natural fools occupied a unique and valued position. The Middle Ages were a time of progression at both ends of the spectrum of the treatment of the disabled. On one end, the cruel abuse of the disabled grew in scale with the increasing populations of Europe and with the moral justifications gained from Christianity. The mistreatment reached new peaks of depravity. However, at the other end, developments in institutional care and the beginnings of modern medicine revolutionized the treatment of the disabled. These were just the first stumbling steps on the path towards changing the perceptions of disabilities. A path that we continue to walk today, and although with hindsight it is easy to judge the actions of those within that time harshly, we nonetheless have to appreciate the positive contributions made, as we would not be where we are today without those first stumbling steps.